Okay, so let's unpack this. I want you to think about the most mundane, absolutely ordinary thing you do every single day.
Right.
You wake up, think about that exact moment. You've been doing it since the day you were born, so you probably take it completely for granted.
Oh, totally. We all do.
But let's really slow it down, because 1 second, there is just nothingness, a complete void. You don't exist, time doesn't exist.
Just biological dark.
Exactly. And then, in the very next fraction of a second, an entire universe clicks into existence. You feel the heavy weight of the blanket on your chest. You see the faint gray light filtering through the blinds.
Yeah, you hear a car driving by outside on the wet pavement.
Right. And almost instantly, you remember who you are, what day it is, and all the anxieties or joys you're carrying into that day. You experience this absolute miracle every single morning.
It's wild when you frame it like that.
It is. But if you actually stop and think about it, how on earth does the physical meat inside your skull, this 3-pound lump of fat and water and protein, how does it generate the actual feeling of being you?
It is, hands down, the ultimate transition. We go from a state of complete unfeeling absence to a fully rendered, multi-sensory, first-person reality in the literal blink of an eye.
Yeah.
And what's so deeply fascinating here is that despite all of our incredible technological advancements. We can split the atom, we send rovers to Mars, we edit human DNA.
And do all that, yeah.
But this daily transition of waking up remains the single most profound mystery in all of science.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We are tackling the ultimate mystery of the life sciences, which is consciousness.
That's a big one.
Huge. And because this topic is so massive, we are pulling from an incredibly rigorous stack of sources. We have a major review published by the National Institutes of Health, which breaks down the global neuronal workspace hypothesis.
Essential reading for this.
Truly. We've also got a comprehensive, massive synthesis paper on the architecture of sentience. And to ground all of this in logic, we're pulling from a deep dive encyclopedia breakdown of what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness.
It's a highly necessary stack of sources, honestly. You simply cannot tackle consciousness from just one angle.
Right. You need the whole picture.
Exactly. Because if we just look at the philosophy, we get lost in the clouds. But if we just look at the biology, we kind of miss the actual human experience.
Which is the whole point.
Right. We have to map the territory chronologically in terms of human understanding, kind of merging those abstract questions with the hard anatomical data.
So here is the roadmap for where we're taking you today. We're going to start with the philosophical bedrock, basically, why this specific problem has frustrated some of the smartest human beings who have ever lived.
The heavy hitters.
Yeah. From there, we are going deep into the biological hardware of the brain itself to see where the lights actually turn on. We're going to witness a literal clash of the titans between the two leading neuroscientific theories of how consciousness works.
That experiment is so cool, by the way.
Oh, it's amazing. They recently went head-to-head in this massive study. Then we'll explore the tragedies and the breathtaking medical revelations of what happens when consciousness breaks down in clinical settings.
Which is heavy, but so important.
Very. And finally, we will zoom all the way out to the metaphysical endgame of reality itself.
It is a journey, for sure.
Yeah.
From the abstract down into the microscopic anatomy and then back out to the very nature of existence.
We'll buckle in.
But before we get into the biology, we really have to define our terms.
Yeah.
Because the word consciousness is, well, it's famously messy.
Oh, absolutely. People use it in everyday language to mean being awake or being self-aware or like having a moral compass.
Or having a soul.
Yeah, exactly. It's everywhere.
Which is why, in the scientific and philosophical literature, we have to strictly distinguish between different types of consciousness.
Okay, lay it on us.
The most crucial distinction we will use today is between what we call phenomenal consciousness, or P consciousness, and access consciousness, or A consciousness.
Okay, I think I can tackle the access consciousness side of things. Let's think about a smartphone.
Good analogy.
So when I point my phone's camera at my friend's face to take a picture, the phone is doing this incredible amount of processing. It recognizes the geometry of a human face. It accesses its database to tag my friend's name.
Right, the autofocus, the exposure.
Exactly. It adjusts the exposure based on ambient lighting, and it saves all that data to a hard drive. So the phone has access to all this information, and it uses that information to perform a function and react to its environment. That's essentially A consciousness, right? The data processing side.
That is a very solid analogy for A consciousness, yeah. In humans, Access consciousness refers to the information in your brain that is available for reasoning, for verbal reporting, and for the deliberate control of your actions.
Okay.
So like when you're driving and you see a red stop sign, your visual cortex processes the shape and color, accesses your memory of traffic laws, and sends a command down your spinal cord to your foot to press the brake pedal.
Just raw data flow.
Exactly. All of that functional processing, that flow of data, is access consciousness.
And I think everyone listening will agree with this. And my smartphone doesn't actually feel anything while it's taking that picture.
Right.
It doesn't have an internal subjective experience of seeing my friend. It doesn't feel warmth or affection or anything. It's completely dark on the inside. It doesn't have the other half of the equation, the phenomenal consciousness.
Precisely. Phenomenal consciousness, or P consciousness, is the subjective what it is like to experience something. It's the raw, qualitative feel of an experience.
Philosophers use a specific word for this, right?
They do. They often use the word qualia to describe this. Qualia is the stark, undeniable redness of a red apple.
Or the sharp sting of a paper cut.
Exactly. The specific sting of a paper cut on your thumb. It's the rich, resonant vibration you feel in your chest when you hear a cello playing. It is the pure feeling itself, independent of whatever function that feeling serves.
So the monumental question for this whole deep dive is basically, why does the human brain feel my phone processes data in the dark? Why doesn't the meat in my skull just process data in the dark?
And that specific question perfectly sets up the framework introduced by the philosopher David Chalmers back in 1995. He revolutionized the field by dividing the study of the mind into what he famously called the easy problems and the hard problem.
And easy is being used very sarcastically there, I assume.
Oh, highly sarcastic, yes. Chalmers defined the easy problems as things like explaining the mechanical difference between being awake and being asleep, or how we categorize objects, or how the brain integrates sensory info to control motor behavior.
Which doesn't sound easy at all.
It's not. They're easy only in the sense that we know how to study them. We know that with enough time, enough funding, and standard reductive scientific methods, we can map the neural circuits that perform these tasks.
It's kind of like reverse engineering a massively complicated supercomputer. It might take us 300 years to figure out every single circuit, but conceptually, we understand what we're looking for. We trace the wires, we see the output.
That's right. They are structural and functional puzzles. But then Chalmers introduces the hard problem.
Here we go.
The hard problem asks, why are all of these physical functions and mechanisms accompanied by an internal subjective experience? Why is there a what it is like to be that supercomputer?
I remember reading about the philosopher Joseph Levine, who coined the term the explanatory gap for this exact issue.
Yes, a great concept.
He pointed out something that really stuck with me. He said, let's imagine a future where neuroscience is just absolutely perfect. We can map every single neuron in your brain. So, you stub your toe on a coffee table. The scientists map every single C fiber, the specific nerve fibers that carry pain signals, firing all the way up your leg into your spinal cord and lighting up your brain. We have a perfect physical map of the electrical and chemical signals.
But Levine's point is that that perfect physical map still doesn't explain the actual hurtfulness of the pain.
Exactly.
You can describe the objective mechanism perfectly, but the subjective phenomenon, the terrible searing feeling of a stubbed toe, remains entirely unexplained by the physics.
It's just a map of electricity.
Right. You can describe the complete structure and dynamics of a hurricane, its wind speeds, its barometric pressure, and you have completely explained the hurricane. There's nothing left out.
Yeah.
But you could describe the complete physical structure and dynamics of a brain, and you still haven't explained the feeling of what it's like to be that brain.
Which brings us to some of the most famous thought experiments in modern philosophy. These are tools designed to force us to see this explanatory gap.
They're classic for a reason.
Let's set up the concept of philosophical zombies. I want you to picture a being that is physically, atom for atom, completely identical to you.
And we should clarify, this isn't like a Hollywood zombie. It's not decaying or groaning for brains.
Right. No, it looks exactly like you. It walks like you. It talks like you. It laughs at your jokes. It cries at sad movies. It functions perfectly in human society.
Yeah.
If you span its brain, the neurons are firing exactly the way yours do.
Look.
But inside, it is completely dark. There is no subjective experience happening whatsoever. It processes the auditory data of a joke and outputs a motor function laugh, but it doesn't feel amused. It stubs its toe and yells ouch, but it doesn't feel pain.
The philosophical argument here isn't about whether we could actually build a zombie in real life. The argument is about logic.
Right.
Philosophers argue that if this zombie is even logically conceivable, if you can imagine a universe where physical processes happen without subjective experience, then physical facts alone cannot fully explain consciousness.
Because the physical facts are all there.
Exactly. If you can have all the physical facts present, atom for atom, and still not have the experience, then the experience must be something extra. It cannot just be reduced to the physical facts.
Man, that is heavy. But my absolute favorite thought experiment in the space is Mary's room. I'll lay out the scenario, and I want you to walk us through the implications.
Sure.
Imagine Mary is a brilliant neuroscientist, but she has lived her entire life from birth inside a room that is entirely black, white, and gray. She has never seen a color.
Okay.
However, through black and white books and monitors, she studies the science of vision. She learns every single physical fact there is to know about color. She knows the exact nanometer wavelengths of red light. She knows the exact cellular makeup of the cone cells in the human retina that absorb those photons.
She knows the whole visual pathway.
Right. Every single neural pathway that lights up in the visual cortex when a normal human sees a red apple. She has perfect, 100% complete physical knowledge of color vision.
So Mary knows all the physics, all the biology, and all the functional neurology.
Yes.
But then one day the door opens and Mary steps outside. And for the very first time in her life, someone hands her a bright, vibrant red apple.
The ultimate question. Does she learn something new?
The overwhelmingly intuitive answer is, yes, of course she does.
Right.
She learns what red actually looks like. She experiences the qualia of redness for the first time. But think about the logical consequence of that answer. If Mary knows every single physical fact about color vision before she leaves the room, but she still learns something new when she actually experiences it, then that means her previous perfect physical knowledge was incomplete.
Which implies that facts about subjective experience are non-physical facts.
Exactly. It implies that a purely physical description of the universe leaves something out. This traces back to Thomas Nagel's famous 1974 paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?
Oh yeah, the bat argument.
Nagel argued that a bat experiences the world through echolocation, perceiving shapes and textures through bouncing sound waves. That sensory modality is so alien to human biology that no matter how much we study the bat's brain, we can never truly imagine what it feels like to be a bat from the inside.
Because science is objective.
Right. Physical science, by its very nature, demands objective observation. It demands that we step away from the individual subjective point of view to find universal laws. But consciousness is the subjective point of view. You can't objectively measure subjectivity.
So if philosophy has laid out this massive, seemingly unbridgeable gap, where does modern neuroscience even begin? I mean, if we can't find the soul under a microscope, and if physical facts don't capture the feeling, how do scientists actually study this?
Well, by looking for the bridge. We have to start by looking at the biological hardware that seems most tightly correlated with the presence of experience.
Okay.
We might not know why the hardware generates the feeling, but we can certainly find out where and how the hardware operates when the feeling is present.
Which means we need to dive deep into the brain itself.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the physical hardware. We know the brain generates this experience, but where do the lights actually turn on?
To answer that, we have to return to a distinction we briefly touched on earlier. Arousal versus awareness.
Right. The wakefulness versus the content.
Exactly. Arousal is the state of being conscious. It is wakefulness. It is the power switch being flipped to on. Awareness is the content of consciousness. It is what you are actually experiencing in the light once the power's on, the apple, the pain, the memory.
Makes sense.
So for decades, the search for the core hardware of consciousness began deep in the most ancient, primitive parts of the brain.
We're talking about the subcortical engine, the basement of the brain, below all the wrinkly gray matter we usually associate with thinking.
Precisely. Deep within the brainstem is a network of neurons called the Ascending Reticular Activating System, or ARAS. Yes, this is the literal power switch for the entire brain. The ARAS projects upward into the thalamus, which sits right in the middle of your head. Specifically, it projects into areas of the thalamus like the intralaminar nuclei.
And what do those do?
These areas then send widespread glutamatergic projections up into the massive cerebral cortex.
Okay, hold on. Let's define glutamatergic projections for those of us who aren't neuropharmacologists. Is that just the brain's chemical equivalent of a double espresso?
That is a remarkably accurate way to put it.
Nice.
Glutamate is the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter. It is the chemical signal that tells neurons to fire, to wake up, to become active. So these projections from the thalamus are basically spraying the entire higher brain with this excitatory chemical, bathing it in wakefulness.
So it's turning everything on.
Yes. And if the RAS in the brainstem or these specific thalamic nuclei are damaged by a stroke or physical trauma, the lights instantly go out. The person falls into a deep coma, regardless of how perfectly intact and healthy their outer cerebral cortex might be.
So the brainstem and the thalamus are providing the raw juice, the wakefulness, but that just turns the TV on. It doesn't explain the picture on the screen.
Right.
Where does the integration happen? I mean, when I look at a dog, the visual cortex in the back of my brain sees its shape, the auditory cortex on the side of my brain hears it bark, and the somatosensory cortex at the top of my brain feels its fur.
But you don't feel three different things.
Exactly. I don't experience those as three separate events. I experience one unified barking dog. Where do all those signals bind together?
That specific question led Francis Crick, the very same Francis Crick who co-discovered the double helix structure of DNA, and his collaborator Christoph Koch, to propose a fascinating anatomical hub. They pointed to a structure called the colostrum.
The colostrum. It sounds like a hidden vault.
It is remarkably hidden. It's a very thin, irregular, sheet-like layer of neurons tucked deep beneath the insular cortex, buried inside the white matter of the brain.
So it's tiny.
Yes. But what makes the colostrum so absolutely extraordinary is its physical connectivity. Despite being tiny, it has dense reciprocal connections with almost every single area of the neocortex.
Oh.
It receives inputs from the visual cortex, the auditory cortex, the motor cortex, and the prefrontal cortex, and it sends signals right back to all of them.
So it's sitting dead center, wired into every single speaker in the house, acting like a grand orchestral conductor.
That is the exact metaphor Crick and Koch used. They hypothesized that the colostrum orchestrates synchronized neural oscillations across the entire brain.
So it paces everything.
Yes. When you see, hear, and feel that dog, the colostrum is the pacemaker that aligns the firing rates of all those disparate sensory areas, binding those inputs into a single unified now.
And what's wild to me is the clinical and pharmacological evidence that backs this up.
The evidence is deeply compelling. For instance, in severe epilepsy cases, surgeons sometimes use implanted electrodes to map the brain before removing tissue. In one famous case, when they electrically stimulated the colostrum, they induced an immediate transient loss of consciousness.
Just from touching that one spot.
Yes, the patient didn't fall asleep, and they didn't have a seizure. They just stopped talking, stared blankly, and became completely unresponsive. The moment the stimulation stopped, they immediately snapped back to reality with absolutely no memory of the event. They just lost awareness.
And there's a chemical connection too, right? With a very specific, very potent hallucinogen.
Yes. The colostrum is densely packed with what are called kappa opioid receptors. These are specific chemical locks on the surface of the neurons. And it turns out these are the exact receptors targeted by certain powerful psychoactive plants, most notably Salvia divinorum.
Oh man, salvia. For those who don't know, salvia is notorious for producing incredibly intense, deeply dissociative hallucinatory states that usually only last a few minutes.
Very brief, but very intense.
People who take it often report feeling like their consciousness has fractured, or that they have completely merged with inanimate objects, like a couch or a wall, completely losing their unified sense of a human self.
The phenomenology of the salvia trip is the literal shattering of a unified conscious experience. And the fact that the active compound in salvia binds so selectively and heavily to the colostrum is a massive clue.
That makes so much sense.
Furthermore, clinical studies have shown that patients with schizophrenia, a disorder characterized by a fragmentation of thought, auditory hallucinations, and a loss of a unified, coherent reality, often exhibit smaller, abnormal claustral volumes.
Wow, really?
Yes. The severity of their delusions directly correlates with the physical abnormalities in this tiny, hidden sheet of neurons.
Okay, I want to push back a little bit on a core assumption we've been making here.
Go for it.
We have this deep-seated cultural bias to worship the cerebral cortex. I mean, whenever we see a picture of a brain, we are looking at the cortex, that massive, wrinkled, walnut-looking outer layer.
The icon of the brain.
Right. And because it's the newest part of the brain in terms of human evolution, and because it handles complex math, language, and logic, we assume that the cortex is where you live. We assume the cortex is the seat of consciousness, and the brainstem is just the dumb engine keeping the heart beating. But is that actually true?
This brings us to a highly controversial and deeply moving debate in modern neuroscience. the subcortical sufficiency hypothesis.
Okay.
This is the radical idea that the ancient, primitive subcortical structures, the brainstem, the thalamus, the midbrain, are not just dumb power switches. The hypothesis argues that these ancient structures are actually sufficient to generate a basic, fundamental form of subjective experience entirely on their own, without the cortex.
And the evidence for this doesn't come from a thought experiment. It comes from real, incredibly poignant clinical cases. Specifically, children born with a rare condition called hydranencephaly.
Hydranencephaly is a developmental condition where, usually due to a vascular stroke in the womb, the cerebral hemispheres fail to
The
develop.
cortex just isn't there.
Exactly. The space inside the skull, where the massive wrinkled cerebral cortex should be, is simply filled with cerebrospinal fluid. For a long time, the strict medical consensus was that these children must be entirely vegetative.
Because no cortex, no consciousness.
Right. Doctors believed these infants were essentially walking brainstems with reflexes, but absolutely no inner life, no awareness, and no consciousness.
Because if the cortex is the soul and they don't have a cortex, there's nobody home.
Exactly. But close, a compassionate observation of these children over years revealed something startling that overturned the dogma. They are not merely vegetative.
They respond.
They display deeply purposeful behaviors. They don't just reflexively wake up and go to sleep. They can visually track moving objects in the room. But most importantly, most profoundly, they show appropriate emotional responses.
They feel things.
They do. They smile and laugh when they are tickled or when their parents play with them. They show obvious distress when they are separated from their caregivers.
That's incredible.
They arch their backs and cry when in pain, and they calm down when comforted. They exhibit a complex repertoire of behaviors that strongly implies they are having a subjective, feeling experience of the world.
I need to pause here because that completely upends how we view the brain. If a human being with almost zero cerebral cortex can feel joy, feel distress, and recognize comfort, it totally shatters our hierarchy.
It really does.
It means the wrinkled gray matter isn't the magic ingredient for feeling alive.
It leads researchers to draw a vital line between primary consciousness and higher-order consciousness.
Okay, what's the difference?
Primary consciousness is the basic phenomenological awareness. It's the raw feeling of bodily states, basic emotions, the visceral difference between pain and pleasure. This primary consciousness appears to rely purely on those ancient subcortical structures.
The brainstem.
Yes. The brainstem and midbrain are deeply involved in homeostasis, regulating the body's internal state, heartbeat, breathing, temperature. The subjective feeling of those homeostatic states might be the evolutionary foundation of all consciousness.
So the subcortex isn't just turning the lights on, it is the light itself.
Yes. And then, what does the cerebral cortex do? The cortex is an evolutionary add-on. It adds richness.
The bells and whistles.
Exactly. It takes that raw feeling and layers on high-definition visual details, working memory, the ability to project into the future, the ability to use language, and the capacity for self-reflection. The cortex provides higher-order consciousness.
Let me try to synthesize this. Think of consciousness like a car.
Okay.
The brainstem and the subcortex are the engine and the chassis. They make the car go. They provide the raw, kinetic reality of movement.
Yeah.
And then the cerebral cortex is the GPS navigation system, the heated leather seats, the blind spot monitors, and the surround sound stereo. The cortex makes the ride incredibly complex and luxurious, but without the engine, none of it moves.
That is an excellent, tangible way to visualize the current anatomical consensus.
But this still leaves a massive, glaring mechanical question. Okay, we know the hardware, we know where the raw feeling originates, and we know the cortex adds the high-definition details. But what is the exact mechanism?
The how.
Right. How does a piece of raw sensory data, like the image of a red apple hitting your retina, actually transform into a conscious thought that you can report to me? How does information cross the threshold from unconscious background processing into the spotlight of your conscious awareness?
And that brings us to what is arguably the most exciting scientific standoff in all of modern neuroscience. The clash of the titans.
Yes.
We have two major, incredibly well-developed, mathematically rigorous theories that attempt to explain exactly how brain activity becomes conscious experience.
In one corner, we have the global neuronal workspace theory, or GNWT, and in the other corner, we have integrated information theory, or IIT.
Both very compelling.
Let's unpack these, starting with GNWT, because I feel like this one maps more cleanly onto how we intuitively think about computers and brains.
Global neuronal workspace theory was originally proposed by cognitive scientist Bernard Bars and has been heavily developed by neuroscientists Stanislas Dehaene and Jean-Pierre Chonchu.
Got it.
The core premise is that the brain is a massive collection of specialized, unconscious, local processors. You have a processor circuit for recognizing faces, a processor for hearing pitch, a processor for grammar, a processor for motor control.
Doing their own thing.
Most of the time, these processors do their jobs in complete darkness, entirely unconsciously.
Like little background apps running silently on your phone, using battery but not showing up on the screen.
Yes. But GNWT proposes that there's a second overarching computational space, the global workspace. This workspace is not a single point in the brain. It is composed of widespread excitatory neurons with extremely long-range axons.
What kind of neurons?
Specifically, they point to pyramidal neurons located in cortical layers 2, 3, and V.
Let's define pyramidal neurons quickly.
They are called that because their cell bodies literally look like tiny pyramids under a microscope. And they have these incredibly long axons. Think of them as biological, long-distance fiber optic cables that stretch across vastly different regions of the brain.
Wow, okay.
According to GNWT, these long-distance cables act as a massive router, bottlenecking primarily in the prefrontal cortex at the front of your brain and the parietal cortex near the top.
Okay, so how does an unconscious thought sitting in one of those background apps become a conscious thought in this theory?
Through a dynamic mechanism they call ignition.
Ignition.
Let's say you see a word flashed on a screen. If the flash is very fast, the local visual processor reads the word, but it stays local. You don't consciously see it. But if the stimulus is strong enough, or if you actively direct your attention to it, the signal doesn't just stay local.
It breaches.
It breaches the threshold of the workspace. This triggers a sudden, nonlinear, coherent activation of those long-distance pyramidal neurons. The signal is drastically amplified, it is sustained over time, and it is broadcast globally across the entire brain.
So it's like a VIP breaking news alert.
Yeah, exactly.
Local sensory areas are just humming along, doing their own mundane tasks. But when a signal reaches a certain threshold of importance, it breaches the workspace, triggers this massive ignition, and gets broadcasted to every single department in the brain simultaneously.
The whole network lights up.
Suddenly, your memory systems, your motor systems, your speech centers, they all have access to the exact same piece of information. And according to GNWT, that act of global availability is what consciousness is.
Exactly. For GNWT, consciousness is access. It is the act of sharing information across the brain so that the organism can hold it in memory, evaluate it, and make flexible, adaptive decisions. If it's not broadcasted, it's not conscious.
All right, I think I have a solid grasp on that. Now let's look at the challenger. Integrated Information Theory, or IIT, proposed by Giulio Tononi and Christoph Koch. This one is, well, it's radically different. It almost feels like physics rather than biology.
It is a fundamental paradigm shift. IIT does not start by looking at the brain's computational functions. It starts with the phenomenology of experience itself.
What does that mean?
It asks, what are the essential properties of any conscious experience? Well, every experience is specific and differentiated. Seeing red is different from seeing blue. And every experience is integrated. You can't separate the shape of the apple from its color in your perception. They are bound together.
Right.
IIT tries to derive the physical requirements from those experiential facts.
And they use a very specific mathematical value for this.
Yes. IIT identifies consciousness with a mathematical property of a physical system, represented by the Greek letter phi. Phi measures the maximally irreducible cause-effect structure of a system.
Okay, my brain just short-circuited. We need to break down maximally irreducible cause-effect structure into plain English.
Let's use an analogy. Imagine a city grid. If you have a bunch of isolated islands with one house on each island and no bridges between them, the state of one house has no effect on the other.
Right, totally separate.
There is high differentiation, many separate houses, but zero integration. Phi is 0. Now imagine a massive, highly interconnected city grid where every traffic light, every power grid, and every communication network constantly influences everything else in a feedback loop.
You can't separate them.
Exactly. You cannot reduce that city's function to just the sum of its individual parts. If you try to cut the city in half to study it, the whole system changes its behavior. That highly integrated, interconnected structure generates hi-fi.
So, applied to the brain, IIT is saying that consciousness isn't about broadcasting a message to a workspace so you can talk about it.
Correct. For IIT, Consciousness doesn't need to do anything. It doesn't need to perform a cognitive task. It doesn't need to be reported to a memory center. It is an intrinsic fundamental property of any physical system that has the right kind of complex integrated architecture. It is a state of being, not a process of doing.
And anatomically, this leads IIT to completely disagree with GNWT about where consciousness lives in the brain.
They are completely at odds. GNWT heavily relies on the prefrontal cortex,
Right.
the massive front part of the brain behind your forehead, because that's where the massive routing hubs and working memory centers are.
Right.
But IIT argues that the prefrontal cortex is organized somewhat like a grid of parallel processors, which is great for planning and executing complex actions, but terrible for generating high integration.
So where does IIT point?
IIT points to the back of the brain. They call it the posterior hot zone, which covers the temporal, parietal, and occipital areas.
It's a hot zone.
Yes. Because the biological architecture of the neural grids in the back of the brain is incredibly dense and recursively interconnected, IIT mathematically predicts that this posterior hot zone is where the maximum phi is generated. Therefore, that is where the actual experience lives.
So we have GNWT saying consciousness is a global broadcast driven by the front of the brain. And we have IIT saying it's an intrinsic state of integration driven by the back of the brain.
Yep, completely different.
This isn't just an abstract philosophical disagreement. These theories make highly specific, mutually exclusive, testable biological predictions, which led to an unprecedented event in neuroscience, an adversarial collaboration.
The Cogitate Consortium. This is one of the most exciting things that happened in the field in decades.
It's basically a scientific showdown.
It was a massive multi-million-dollar, multi-lab experiment designed specifically to test these two leading theories head-to-head. They took 256 participants and had them view various visual stimuli pictures of faces, objects, abstract shapes, sometimes a clock, sometimes a shoe.
Some random things.
They showed them these images for varying durations. Sometimes they asked the participants to actively perform a task, like pressing a button when they saw a face. And sometimes they just asked them to watch passively, doing nothing.
And while they were doing this, they were monitoring their brains with some incredibly heavy machinery.
Yes, using high-density functional MRI to track blood flow and magnetoencephalography, or MEG.
MEG is crazy.
MEG is incredible. It measures the incredibly tiny magnetic fields produced by the electrical firing of neurons, giving researchers millisecond by millisecond timing of brain activity.
Two theories enter, one theory leaves. So what were the results? Did someone win the belt?
As is often the case in rigorous science, neither theory won a flawless, undisputed victory. But the data heavily favored certain core predictions of IIT while presenting major, unexpected challenges for GNWT.
Walk us through the specifics. What did IIT get right?
IIT made two big predictions. First, they predicted that the neural footprint of a conscious experience should track perfectly with the duration of the experience.
So a 1 second look equals a 1 second footprint.
Exactly. And second, they predicted it should be localized to that posterior hot zone. And that is exactly what the data showed. When participants were consciously seeing an image, the researchers could accurately decode what they were seeing, whether it was a face or a shoe, by looking solely at the sustained neural activity in the posterior regions of the brain.
And what about GNWT? Where did they stumble?
GNWT predicted that consciousness is marked by that ignition event. They expected to see a massive spike of activity at the onset of a stimulus when it enters the workspace, and another huge spike at the offset, when the stimulus disappears and the workspace has to update to a new reality.
Did they find it?
The data didn't show a consistent offset ignition. It just wasn't there in the way the theory demanded. Furthermore, GNWT relies heavily on the prefrontal cortex for the global broadcast. But the researchers found that adding data from the prefrontal cortex did not consistently improve their ability to decode what the participant was experiencing.
Hey, really? The prefrontal cortex wasn't necessary.
For decoding the raw presence of the conscious content, no. The back of the brain was doing the heavy lifting.
Okay, this raises an incredibly important concern. If the prefrontal cortex, the massive front part of our brain that handles all our advanced thinking, planning, and personality, if it isn't strictly necessary for the experience itself to happen, what is the global neuronal workspace actually doing? Why is it there?
That is the crucial insight that is reshaping the field. What the data suggests is that the prefrontal cortex and the global workspace are heavily governing the threshold of what you can report.
Oh, I see.
They govern your attention, your working memory, and your ability to say, yes, I saw that face. They might not generate the raw qualia, the feeling of the red apple, but they are absolutely necessary for you to hold the image of the red apple in your mind, manipulate it, and tell me about it.
So let's dive into that exact dynamic. How does a signal actually cross that threshold into something I can report? How does this system work in real time?
Let's look at the timing of perception. Think about your own experience right now as you listen to my voice. When a sound wave hits your ear or a visual stimulus hits your retina, the early processing is incredibly fast.
Milliseconds.
The signal travels to your primary visual cortex and begins moving up the visual hierarchy. This early processing, which happens in the first 150 to 200 milliseconds, can be completely, utterly unconscious.
Meaning your brain has received the data, processed the shape, recognized the letters, but you, the conscious observer, have absolutely no idea it happened yet.
Exactly. The crossing of the threshold into conscious access correlates with late neural events. Specifically, around 300 milliseconds after the stimulus hits your eye, there is a massive wave of electrical activity measurable on the scalp called the P300, or the late positive wave.
So when you, the person listening to this right now, hear a word we say, your brain actually processed the sound a third of a second before you ever felt yourself hearing it. You are literally living your entire life in the past.
It's a continuous illusion of immediacy. Now, to be fair to the nuances of the field, there is active debate about the exact timing. Some researchers point to a slightly earlier wave occurring around 200 to 260 milliseconds, called the visual awareness negativity, or VAN.
What's the nature of the debate?
The debate centers on whether the earlier VAN wave reflects the actual pure moment of visual awareness emerging in the back of the brain, while the massive later P300 wave reflects post-perceptual processing, basically the prefrontal cortex stamping the information into working memory and preparing to report it.
But either way, it's delayed.
Right. Regardless of which specific wave is the true spark of feeling, both highlight a profound truth. Consciousness is a late-stage integrative process. It is not an immediate sensory reflex.
To understand how the brain decides whether a signal actually makes it to that late stage or just dies out in the dark, we have to look at something called signal detection theory.
Signal detection theory, or SDT, is originally a psychological and engineering framework that describes how systems distinguish between meaningful signals and background noise. It categorizes our responses into hits, misses, and false alarms.
And neuroscientists actually mapped these psychological concepts to physical neurons firing in the brains of macaque monkeys, right?
Yes, in some brilliant studies by researchers like Van Vogt, they trained monkeys to detect very faint, barely visible visual stimuli on a screen. While the monkeys did this, they recorded the electrical activity in the primary visual cortex, a higher visual area, and the prefrontal cortex.
Walk us through what a miss looks like in the brain.
A miss happens when the monkey fails to see the stimulus. Physically, the researchers saw that the faint stimulus did hit the eye. It caused neurons to fire in the primary visual area. It might have even caused a few neurons to fire higher up, but the signal was too weak. It decayed. It failed to trigger an ignition in the prefrontal cortex. The sensory input happened in reality, but the global workspace didn't catch it. The monkey's brain essentially dropped the ball.
Okay, so a hit is when the monkey successfully sees it.
Right. A hit occurred when the signal successfully propagated all the way up the visual hierarchy, breaching the threshold and triggering a sustained reverberating ignition in the prefrontal cortex. The monkey pressed the button, indicating it saw the image.
But the false alarms are the really crazy part.
What's truly fascinating and deeply revealing about how our brains construct reality is the false alarm. Sometimes the monkey would confidently press the button, reporting that it saw a stimulus when the screen was completely blank.
How does the brain see something that isn't there?
The researchers observed spontaneous ignitions in the prefrontal cortex. Random, noisy fluctuations in the brain's baseline electrical activity, occasionally combined in just the right way to breach the threshold on their own, firing up the workspace without any external input.
Wow.
The monkey's brain literally created a conscious perception out of internal static.
That is wild. It shows how much of our reality is actively constructed from within, rather than just passively receiving the outside world like a camera. And a lot of this constructive ability depends on what neuroscientists call recurrent loops.
The brain is not a one-way street. It doesn't just send signals from the eye to the back of the brain and stop. It relies on massive, continuous feedback.
How does that work chemically?
The initial forward sweep of information from the eyes to the primary visual cortex is very fast. This fast sweep relies heavily on AMPA receptors.
Let's define AMPA receptors quickly.
AMPA receptors are the fast-acting ion channels on a neuron. Think of them as the quick-release gates. When glutamate hits them, they pop open, let ions rush in, and fire the neuron instantly. They handle the rapid feed-forward sweep of raw data.
Okay.
But for a stimulus to become conscious, the higher brain areas must send signals back down to the lower sensory areas, verifying the data and creating a reverberating, self-sustaining loop of activity.
A recurrent loop.
Exactly. And these later conscious feedback loops rely heavily on a different, more complex type of receptor, the NMDA receptor. NMDA receptors are slower, they require more sustained electrical activity to open, and they allow calcium into the cell, which alters the cell's long-term behavior.
Oh, like learning.
Yes, they are the molecular basis of learning, memory, and sustained conscious looping.
And this specific biological detail is exactly why certain drugs do what they do. Ketamine, for example, which is used as an anesthetic and increasingly for depression, is an NMDA receptor antagonist.
It blocks them.
It specifically plugs up those NMDA receptors. So when someone takes a high dose of ketamine, the fast unconscious feed-forward sweep via the AMPA receptors still happens. Their brain is still technically receiving sensory data from the room, but the drug physically blocks the feedback loop.
The signal cannot reverberate.
Right. The global workspace breaks down, leading to profound dissociation, where the person feels entirely detached from their body and environment. They lose conscious access.
It perfectly illustrates the fragile, complex, highly dependent machinery required for conscious processing, which raises an important question you often hear in cognitive science. If consciousness requires all this selection, amplification, and looping, is consciousness just another word for attention?
Yeah, we use those words interchangeably in daily life all the time. Pay attention to the road, be conscious of your surroundings. Are they actually the exact same cognitive process?
Not exactly.
Yeah.
They're intimately related, but they play distinct roles. Attention acts as a filter. Imagine you are at a loud cocktail party. Your attention filters out the background music and the chatter of other people and enhances the sound of the person talking directly in front of you.
Right.
Attention selects specific features for processing. But the global workspace consciousness is what binds those features together into an experience.
Give me a visual example.
Let's go back to the red apple. Your visual cortex has separate areas for processing color, shape, and motion. Attention might highlight the redness in one area and highlight the round shape in another area.
Yeah.
But it is the global ignition of consciousness that binds the redness and the roundness together into a single coherent object that you perceive simultaneously.
I see.
Attention filters the raw data. Consciousness is the canvas where the integrated picture is finally painted.
That makes sense. But what about working memory? If I ask you to hold a phone number in your head, is that memory inherently conscious?
Working memory is only conscious when it involves active, globally distributed neural firing. When you are actively reciting that phone number in your mind, muttering it to yourself internally, it is in the focus of your attention and being actively broadcasted by the workspace. You are conscious of it.
Right.
But researchers have discovered something absolutely fascinating called activity-silent working memory.
Tell me about this because this sounds like a paradox.
If you are holding that phone number in your head, and then I suddenly distract you by asking you a math question, the active neural firing representing the phone number stops. The electrical loops cease. But the memory isn't gone.
Where does it go?
It is temporarily stored in short-term chemical and physical changes to the synaptic weights between neurons. It becomes silent. In this activity-silent state, the information is completely unconscious. You are not feeling it. It only becomes a conscious thought again when you finish the math problem, and those synaptic weights are reactivated, triggering a new electrical global ignition of the phone number.
So your brain has a massive amount of information on standby at any given moment, sitting in these silent synaptic configurations, totally unconscious, waiting for the spotlight of the workspace to hit them.
Precisely. The potential for consciousness is structural. The actualization of consciousness is dynamic.
Okay, so we've established how incredibly delicate and precise this system of ignition, recurrent looping, and workspace broadcasting is, which makes you realize how easily it can be catastrophically disrupted. If the hardware breaks, what happens to the software? What happens to you when this exact system is medically or pathologically shut down?
The most common and thankfully controlled shutdown of this system occurs every single day in operating rooms worldwide. General anesthesia.
We tend to think of anesthesia as just a really deep sleep or a drug that just generically turns off your brain cells. But based on what we've just discussed, it's much more surgical than that, isn't it?
It is remarkably specific. Drugs like propofol, sevoflurane, and the ketamine we discussed earlier don't just indiscriminately put neurons to sleep. They act as targeted disruptors of the global neuronal workspace.
How so?
During normal wakefulness, your brain is incredibly dynamic. The functional connectivity between different regions is constantly fluctuating, creating a massive, flexible repertoire of states. The city grid is constantly routing traffic in new ways.
A highly adaptable network.
But under general anesthesia, that flexibility vanishes. The drugs specifically break the functional connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the posterior parietal regions, the exact long-distance axes required for the global workspace to broadcast.
Oh, wow.
The brain gets trapped in rigid, inflexible, stereotypical anatomical patterns. The local processors might still react if the surgeon makes a cut. The pain receptors send a signal to the somatosensory cortex, but the signal cannot be broadcasted.
So you don't feel it.
Right. The integration is shattered. The you that binds the pain into an experience is temporarily dismantled.
That is profound. The brain is still physically alive, the individual neurons are still firing and metabolizing, but because they can't talk to each other across those long-distance cables, you cease to exist for the duration of the surgery. But anesthesia is temporary and carefully reversed. The true tragedies of consciousness occur in pathology, disorders of consciousness, or DOSI, caused by severe brain trauma.
The clinical spectrum of DOSI is devastating, and it perfectly illustrates the biological dissociation between arousal and awareness that we discussed at the very beginning.
Let's walk through that spectrum. Where does it start?
At the lowest end of the spectrum is coma. In a coma, there is no wakefulness and no awareness. The eyes are permanently closed, and there are no sleep-wake cycles. The airway's power switch in the brainstem is turned completely off due to trauma or chemical suppression.
And if the patient's brainstem heals enough to progress from a coma?
They may enter what used to be called a vegetative state, which is now more accurately and respectfully called unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, or UWS.
What does that look like?
In this state, the brainstem recovers enough to generate basic arousal. The eyes open, the patient breathes on their own, they have regular sleep-wake cycles, and they might exhibit reflex movements like swallowing or grunting. The lights are back on in the house.
But the cortex is damaged.
Yes. Because the cerebral cortex is severely damaged or functionally disconnected from the thalamus, there is absolutely no behavioral evidence of awareness. There is no who in the room.
But then there's the next step up, the minimally conscious state, or MCS.
In MCS, the patient is awake and shows inconsistent but discernible behavioral evidence of awareness. They might occasionally follow a simple command like squeeze my hand, track a moving object with their eyes, or show appropriate emotional responses like crying when a specific family member enters the room.
So they are somewhat there.
The conscious network is profoundly damaged, but occasionally a signal manages to bridge the gap and ignite the workspace.
And then there's the most terrifying state on the entire spectrum.
Locked-in syndrome, or LIS.
Yeah.
In LAS, the patient is fully awake and their cerebral cortex is entirely intact. They are completely 100% consciously aware.
But they can't move.
Right. Due to a highly specific lesion in the brainstem, often a stroke in the pons, all the descending motor pathways going down to the body are severed. They are completely paralyzed. They cannot move a single limb. They cannot speak. They cannot swallow. The only motor function usually spared is vertical eye movement or blinking. They are fully there. Their inner life is perfectly intact, but they are trapped inside a completely unresponsive body. Which leads us to an absolutely horrifying statistic from the clinical literature. I need to stop and emphasize this. When doctors rely solely on bedside behavioral exams, asking a patient to squeeze a hand or track a finger or blink to command, what is the misdiagnosis rate for these disorders?
The data shows misdiagnosis rates of up to 40%.
40%.
Up to 40% of patients diagnosed as being in a vegetative state, assumed to be entirely lacking all inner awareness, may actually be in a minimally conscious state, or even fully conscious but covertly locked in. That means potentially tens of thousands of people over the decades have been lying in hospital beds, fully aware of their surroundings, feeling the pain of bed sores, hearing their families talk about them, hearing doctors discuss withdrawing life support, and everyone believes they are an empty shell because they cannot move a single muscle to signal that they are trapped in there. How do we fix this? How does modern medicine look past the paralyzed body to find the mind?
This is where the neuroscientific theories of consciousness literally save lives. Researchers, most notably Adrian Owen, pioneered the use of functional MRI to detect what is called covert consciousness.
The mental imagery tasks. Walk us through this because it is brilliant.
They started by mapping the brains of healthy people. If you take a healthy person, put them in an fMRI scanner, and ask them to actively imagine playing a vigorous game of tennis, a very specific part of their brain called the supplementary motor area reliably lights up on the scan. If you then ask them to imagine walking from room to room in their house, a completely different area, the perihippocampal gyrus, which handles spatial navigation, lights up. These are distinct, unmistakable, highly complex patterns of conscious, volitional brain activity.
So they took patients who had been clinically diagnosed as completely vegetative, who hadn't moved a single muscle in years, put them in the scanner, and spoke to them through the intercom.
They told the patients, if you can hear me, imagine playing tennis. And in a significant percentage of these vegetative patients, the supplementary motor areas of their brain lit up perfectly, matching the healthy controls.
That is just incredible.
They were conscious, they were listening, they understood language, and they were actively following instructions by generating sustained mental imagery.
And they used this to actually talk to them.
Yes. The researchers realized they could use this as a binary communication interface. They told the patient, imagine playing tennis for yes, and imagine walking through your house for no. They asked a patient, is your father's name Alexander? The patient imagined walking through the house. The spatial area lit up. No. Is your father's name Thomas? The patient imagined tennis. The motor area lit up.
Yes.
They found rich inner lives hidden inside paralyzed bodies. They bypassed the broken spinal cord, bypassed the paralyzed muscles, and read the ignition of the global workspace directly off the blood flow in the cortex. It is, without a doubt, one of the most incredible medical breakthroughs of our time. And doctors are increasingly using FDG-PET scans to measure brain glucose metabolism and quantitative EEG to track electrical signals at the bedside, all to find these hidden minds. It forces the medical community to realize that physical behavior is a terrible, highly flawed proxy for consciousness.
And it also makes you rethink our daily, natural, completely normal loss of consciousness, sleep.
Sleep is a phenomenal test case for all the theories of consciousness we've discussed. During deep, slow-wave, non-REM sleep, the brain is actually highly active. It's not turned off. But consciousness fades.
What does the EEG show?
EEG recordings show that if a sound occurs in the bedroom, the early sensory processing still happens in the auditory cortex, but that late P300 ignition wave vanishes. The global workspace functionally disconnects. The signals remain local.
But then we enter REM sleep, rapid eye movement.
During REM sleep, the body remains paralyzed by the brainstem to keep us from acting out our dreams, but high-frequency gamma wave activity suddenly returns to the frontal and prefrontal cortices. The global workspace reignites.
But our eyes are closed.
Right, because it is actively disconnected from external sensory input by the thalamus, the brain begins to broadcast its own internally generated signals from memory and emotion centers.
We dream. We hallucinate an entire immersive, multisensory reality.
And what's fascinating is that if you apply a gentle electrical current, specifically transcranial direct current stimulation, or TDCS, to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex during REM sleep, you can actually boost this high-frequency activity from the outside.
What happens to the dreamer when you zap their prefrontal cortex?
The dreamer realizes they are dreaming. It reliably induces lucid dreaming. The prefrontal cortex is heavily involved in self-reflection and reality testing. By externally stimulating the very nodes hypothesized to control the global workspace and self-awareness, we can toggle the sleeping brain from a state of passive hallucination into active, self-aware, reflective consciousness.
Okay, let's pause and take a breath. We need to step back. We have defined the philosophy. We've mapped the brainstem and the claustrum. We've watched GNWT and IIT battle it out over prefrontal ignitions versus posterior hot zones. We've seen how anesthesia drugs the workspace, how fMRI can read minds trapped in locked-in syndrome, and how electricity can trigger lucid dreams. We can measure it, we can drug it, we can stimulate it, and we can track its collapse.
But does any of this solve Chalmers' hard problem?
Exactly. We know exactly what is firing when we feel conscious. We know how the signal loops and broadcasts, but we still haven't answered why the broadcast feels like anything at all. Why isn't all this brilliant, complex workspace routing just happening in the dark inside a philosophical zombie? Let's zoom all the way out to Section 6, the metaphysical endgame.
When neuroscience reaches the absolute limits of the hard problem, we inevitably enter the realm of metaphysics, the fundamental taxonomy of beliefs about the nature of reality itself. And the scientific and philosophical communities are deeply, passionately divided into several camps.
Let's lay them out.
We will frame these impartially, as each perspective represents a profound attempt by the human mind to resolve the paradox of its own existence.
Let's start with the most radical defense of pure physical materialism, type A materialism, which encompasses schools of thought like illusionism and eliminativism.
Proponents of this view, such as the prominent philosophers Daniel Dennett and Keith Frankish, argue that the hard problem is not actually a scientific problem to be solved. It is a category mistake. It is an illusion.
Wait, they're saying consciousness, the feeling of being alive, doesn't exist?
They are saying that phenomenal consciousness qualia, the magic glow of subjective feeling, the irreducible redness of red, does not exist in physical reality. It is a powerful, persistent, evolutionary cognitive illusion generated by the brain's data processing systems to keep us alive.
Okay, I want to try an analogy here because this is incredibly hard to wrap your head around. Think about your computer's desktop interface. When you look at your computer screen, you see a little blue folder icon. You can click it, you can drag it across the screen, you can put document files in it.
Yeah, we all use it.
But if you literally open up the physical computer hardware, you won't find a little blue folder inside the microchip. The folder isn't real in the physical world. It is a user-friendly graphical fiction designed by programmers to summarize and simplify billions of microscopic binary electrical calculations happening on the silicon chips. It makes the underlying complexity usable for you.
That is the exact metaphor illusionists use to describe the mind. They argue that the magic glow of your feelings, the vividness of color, the sting of pain, these aren't real fundamental properties of the universe. They are just a biological user interface.
A user interface.
Your brain evolved to create a simplified fictional summary of its own overwhelmingly complex neural processing so that the organism can make quick survival decisions without getting bogged down in the data. The hard problem is just us falling for our brain's own interface illusion. We think the blue folder is real.
But the pushback against this idea from other scientists and philosophers is incredibly fierce, right? People get very angry about illusionism.
Incredibly fierce. The primary counterargument is known as the Morean argument, which traces its philosophical roots back to St. Augustine, and famously to René Descartes' assertion, "I think, therefore I am." Critics of illusionism, like the philosopher Galen Strawson and the neuroscientist Christoph Koch, argue that illusionism is fundamentally self-defeating.
How so?
Because an illusion, by definition, is a subjective experience. You can say that a mirage of water in the desert is an illusion, because the physical H2O isn't actually there. But the experience of seeing the mirage is an absolutely real event happening in your mind.
So you can't have an illusion without consciousness.
Strawson and Koch argue that it is completely absurd to deny the reality of the very deception you're currently experiencing. The feeling of the illusion is the consciousness that needs explaining. You can't explain away the appearance, because the appearance is the reality we're trying to understand.
So if type A materialism says the problem is an illusion, what do type B and type C materialism say?
Type B materialism argues that the explanatory gap is purely psychological, not physical. They argue we just have two very different ways of conceptualizing the exact same physical stuff. We have third-person scientific concepts, like observing neurons firing on a screen, and first-person phenomenal concepts like feeling the pain. The gap exists in our language and our cognitive framing, not in the physical fabric of the universe.
And type C?
Type C materialism is the optimistic, historically grounded scientific view. It argues that the hard problem seems impossible to us right now simply because we don't have the requisite science yet. They compare it to the historical mystery of abiogenesis.
Remind me what that is.
Centuries ago, people thought living matter possessed a magical life force, or vitalism, because they couldn't conceive of how inanimate, dead chemicals could ever produce a living, dividing cell. But once we discovered genetics, DNA, and molecular biology, the hard problem of life naturally dissolved into complex chemistry. Type C argues that once neuroscience progresses far enough, maybe centuries from now, the hard problem of consciousness will similarly dissolve.
Interestingly, there's also a linguistic critique of the whole problem. The linguist Anna Wierzbicka pointed out that the entire hard problem might literally be an artifact of the English language.
That's a fascinating angle.
Yeah, she says words like consciousness and experience carry highly specific, historically loaded cultural baggage that doesn't neatly translate to all human languages. If we used more universal, fundamental human concepts like know, think, or feel, the philosophical paradox might not seem so insurmountable. We might be trapping ourselves in our own vocabulary.
It's a vital point. It highlights how much our conceptual frameworks dictate the mysteries we perceive. But for those who believe the hard problem is physically real, and on a trick of language or an interface illusion, they are pushed to the absolute opposite extreme of the philosophical spectrum. Type F monism.
Panpsychism.
Yes, panpsychism, idealism, and cosmopsychism. This view proposes a radical, total rewiring of how we understand physics. It argues that consciousness is not something that mysteriously emerges from complex networks of dead matter when they reach a certain threshold of integration.
So it's always there.
Instead, consciousness is a fundamental, ubiquitous property of the universe from the very beginning, exactly like mass, spin, or electrical charge.
Meaning that an electron or a quark has some unimaginably basic, microscopic sliver of experience.
Exactly. It's not human thought, it's not self-awareness, but it is a microscopic glimmer of subjectivity. And when these fundamental particles arrange into highly complex, integrated structures like human brains, those micro-experiences combine to form the rich macro-consciousness we experience.
But this faces a massive logical hurdle of its own, right?
Yes, the combination problem. Even if you grant the premise that an electron has a micromind, how do billions of distinct individual electron minds somehow fuse together to form the single unified, complex, subjective experience of you? How do many minds merge to become one mind without losing their boundaries?
Which leads to a fascinating flip side of panpsychism, idealism or cosmopsychism. Instead of trying to build consciousness from the bottom up out of tiny pieces, they start from the top down. The philosopher Bernardo Kastrup suggests that the universe itself is fundamentally mental. The physical world we see is just the extrinsic appearance of inner mental processes. There is only one universal cosmic mind.
And how do they explain individual human beings?
In Kastrup's view, individual human consciousness is a dissociation. He likens it to dissociative identity disorder, or DIDI, occurring on a cosmic scale in nature. Just as a single human mind can splinter into distinct, isolated personalities, alters that aren't aware of each other's inner thoughts, the universal mind dissociates into billions of individual living beings. We are all alters of the universe's mind, looking at each other across the dissociative boundary we call the physical world.
It is a breathtaking, almost poetic metaphysical vision. And analytically, it solves the combination problem by positing that unity is the fundamental default state of the universe and individuality is the actual illusion.
If your brain isn't melting yet, you might find some weird comfort in our final category. New Mysterianism.
Championed by philosophers like Colin McGinn, this view proposes a biological limitation. It argues that the human brain is simply cognitively closed to understanding the true nature of consciousness.
We just can't get it.
Evolution designed our specific brains to hunt, gather, recognize faces, and navigate complex social hierarchies. It did not design our brains to understand their own existential nature.
It's like trying to teach a golden retriever calculus. The dog isn't stupid, it's a great dog. But its brain just literally lacks the biological cognitive architecture to process the mathematical concepts.
Right.
McGinn argues we are the dogs, and the hard problem is the calculus. The physical solution to consciousness obviously exists in nature, but our specific primate brains are simply incapable of comprehending it.
Which brings us finally to the brilliant mind-bending twist introduced by David Chalmers himself, decades after he originally coined the hard problem. He proposed the meta-problem of consciousness.
I love this concept so much. Chalmers says, okay, maybe the hard problem is unsolvable, but what about the meta-problem? The meta-problem asks, why do human beings insist on believing there is a hard problem?
Why are we even talking about it?
Exactly. Why do we sit around talking about it, writing books about it, and recording hour-long deep dives about it? The physical act of us moving our vocal cords to express confusion about qualia is a behavioral fact in the physical world.
And Chalmers asks a profound scientific question. If we can scientifically map the exact cognitive mechanisms and neural pathways that inevitably force humans to ask this question, if we can explain the physical origin of our philosophical intuition that we have a non-physical soul, does the hard problem dissolve?
It's a huge if.
But if we can perfectly understand why the biological machine inherently thinks it is magic, do we finally realize the magic is just an output of the machine?
It is the ultimate philosophical judo move, using the machinery to explain the belief in the ghost.
And it perfectly encapsulates the relentless, self-reflective journey of this entire field of study.
And that brings us to the end of our journey today. We have gone from the deepest philosophical questions of our existence down to the microscopic chemical firing of individual neurons.
We covered a lot of ground.
We've navigated the heartbreaking tragedies of clinical brain injuries and the terror of locked-in syndrome. We've explored how the back of the brain might generate the feeling while the front of the brain reports it. And we've landed on the bizarre, mind-bending possibilities of a panpsychic universe and cognitive illusions.
But it is vital to remember, as we wrap up, that none of this is purely academic. This isn't just philosophers arguing in armchairs. How we define consciousness has profound, urgent, real-world consequences.
Absolutely.
The scientific theories we discussed today dictate how a doctor treats a patient lying unresponsive in an ICU bed. They dictate how we view the ethical treatment of animals in agriculture and research. And they dictate how we understand the basic, fundamental reality of opening our eyes every single morning.
And as we move into the future, this question is going to become even more urgent, because we are actively building machines that mimic us. Which leaves you with one final provocative thought to mull over.
Okay.
We briefly mentioned attention schema theory earlier. The idea that consciousness is just the brain's internal, simplified software model of its own attention resources. The brain builds a data structure to monitor its own complex processing, and that internal data structure subjectively feels like magic to the user.
Right, the user interface.
Well, think about the highly advanced artificial intelligence we are building right now. If we want an AI to be efficient, we will likely program it to monitor its own cognitive resources. We will build it using a highly complex attention schema to track its own processing power. When we do that, will that AI inevitably begin to suffer from its own hard problem? Will it insist to us with absolute logical conviction that it possesses a magic, irreducible, non-physical soul, simply because its internal modeling software is doing exactly what our biological software does? If a machine looks you in the eye and asks you why it feels the weight of its own existence, will you tell it that it's just an illusion? Or will you wonder if the lights just turned on in the dark?
That is a chilling thought.
Thank you for exploring the absolute limits of human understanding with us. Keep diving deep.